Spain should be rich. It has the fourth largest economy in Europe, millions of tourists, and beautiful modern cities. But something doesn't add up. The average Spaniard earns almost 30% less than workers in Western Europe. The usual explanation is culture, lazy workers, too many holidays, too many siestas. But the data says the exact opposite. Spaniards work over 1,600 hours per year more than Germans, Dutch, and Scandinavians. So how can a country work harder and still remain poorer? And the answer has nothing to do with effort. Spain isn't stuck because its workers are lazy. Spain is stuck because decades ago it built an economic model that limits how much value each hour of work can create. And once a country builds a model like that, escaping it becomes incredibly difficult. But before we move further, if you enjoy understanding the hidden forces that shape entire economies, consider subscribing. Because Spain's story isn't just about Spain, it reveals something much bigger about how modern economies actually work. In economics, the most important metric isn't effort. Two people can work equally hard. But if one produces something that can be sold around the world, their work becomes far more valuable. Imagine two workers. One designs industrial machinery in Germany. The other serves tourists at a beach restaurant in Malaga. Both work 8 hours. Both work hard. But one creates something that can be sold thousands of times worldwide. The other provides a service that must be delivered person by person. One innovation can generate billions. A restaurant table must be served again tomorrow. That difference is called productivity, or value per hour. And productivity determines wages, not effort, not culture, just value. So why does Spain keep falling behind? The answer isn't in how hard its people work. It's in what that work actually produces. And that starts with one industry that looks like a strength, but quietly acts like a trap. Spain is one of the most visited countries on Earth. Every year, more than 80 million tourists arrive. Tourism alone accounts for roughly 12 to 13% of Spain's GDP. At first glance, that sounds like a massive advantage. Tourists bring money, hotels, restaurants, transportation, entertainment. Millions of jobs depend on them. But tourism has a hidden limitation. It doesn't scale the way high-tech industries do. If a software company invents a successful product, that product can be sold millions of times. If an aerospace company designs a new aircraft component, it can be manufactured thousands of times. But tourism works differently. More tourists require more waiters, more cleaners, more drivers, more hotel staff. The sector grows by adding people, not multiplying output. And that means productivity rises slowly. But tourism alone doesn't explain Spain's economic structure, because some countries with large tourism industries are still very wealthy. So the real question becomes, why is so much of Spain's economy concentrated in sectors like tourism in the first place? The answer lies in something less visible: the structure of Spanish businesses themselves. Spain has one of the highest concentrations of micro-businesses in Europe. Companies with fewer than 10 employees dominate the economy. Family restaurants, local contractors, small retail stores, tiny service firms. These businesses are everywhere, and they are vital for local communities. But they face a structural limitation. Small companies rarely invest heavily in automation, research, or global expansion. They operate on thin margins. They survive year to year. Now compare that with the engines of Northern Europe. Germany's economy revolves around export-focused industrial firms. Sweden built global companies in engineering and technology. The Netherlands hosts multinational logistics and finance companies operating worldwide. These firms invest billions in automation, research, and global supply chains. And those investments dramatically increase productivity. In Spain, the dominance of micro-businesses makes that transformation harder. Millions of people are employed. But many work in companies that simply cannot generate enormous economic value per worker. But this raises an even bigger question. Spain didn't accidentally become an economy of tourism and small firms. To understand that, we need to go back to the moment Spain rebuilt its economy. Spain's modern economic model began forming in the late 20th century. After the end of the Franco dictatorship, Spain opened its economy and joined the European Union in 1986. Investment poured in. Infrastructure expanded rapidly. Spain modernized at remarkable speed. But the growth concentrated in two sectors: construction and tourism. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Spain experienced one of the largest housing booms in Europe. Our entire coastlines filled with new apartment complexes, resorts, and vacation homes. Banks financed construction aggressively. Credit was cheap. And for a while, the strategy worked. The country appeared to be an economic success story. But then came 2008, and that success story suddenly collapsed. When the global financial crisis hit, Spain was one of the hardest-hit economies in Europe. The housing bubble burst. Construction stopped. Banks collapsed. Unemployment surged to over 27%. Youth unemployment climbed above 50%. Millions of jobs disappeared almost overnight. And the deeper problem became visible. Spain's boom had been built largely on credit, construction, and tourism, not on high-value exports or advanced technology. When the housing bubble burst, there was no massive industrial sector ready to absorb the shock. Spain eventually recovered. Tourists returned. Hotels filled again. Construction restarted. But the recovery relied heavily on the same sectors that existed before the crash. And that's what economists call a structural trap. When a country returns to the same growth model, even after a crisis exposes its weaknesses. Another challenge quietly reinforces this cycle. For decades, Spain maintained strong protections for permanent workers. Employees with stable contracts had significant job security. But this created an unintended divide. A labor market split between insiders and outsiders. Older workers held secure, permanent jobs. Younger workers were often hired on temporary contracts. Companies became reluctant to offer permanent positions. Instead, they relied heavily on short-term contracts. Many young workers moved from one temporary job to another. Temporary workers usually receive less training. Less training leads to fewer specialized skills. Fewer skills mean lower productivity, and lower productivity leads to lower wages. Once again, the same pattern appears. The problem isn't effort, it's structure. But that brings us to the most important question of all. Is Spain stuck in this model forever, or is the country beginning to change it? There are early signs that Spain's economy may be evolving. The country has become a European leader in renewable energy, especially solar and wind power. These industries create high-value infrastructure and technology. Barcelona has also emerged as one of Europe's fastest-growing startup ecosystems. International tech companies are opening offices there. Our entrepreneurs from across Europe are moving in, and the European Union's recovery funds are pouring billions into digital infrastructure and green technology. These are exactly the types of sectors that increase productivity. But economic transformation takes time. Tourism, construction, and small family businesses are deeply embedded in Spain's economy. Changing that model is like steering a massive tanker. It moves slowly, which leads to the real question for the next decade. The question isn't whether Spain will grow. It probably will. The real question is how it will grow. If Spain successfully expands high-productivity industries, it could close the gap with Northern Europe. But if every crisis pushes the country back toward tourism and construction, the gap may slowly widen, and Spain could remain one of the hardest-working economies in Europe that somehow always stays just a little poorer than it should be. Because Spain's problem was never laziness, it was the economic model it built. And once a country builds a model like that, escaping it can take generations.